welcome to our session on credential transparency. And I hope that you all are in the right place. And if not, I hope you'll stay anyway, because we are about to have a great discussion about what is possible when you empower people with information about their pathways and decision points through education and into the workforce. I'm going to kick us off with some initial comments about using Credential and other data to support individual pathways. My colleague Scott will then join to provide some more detailed discussion about credentials, and then my colleague Jim will wrap us up to tell us a little bit about what Alabama is doing. So just by way of starting, all of us hit points in our life where we have to make decisions about what comes next and the pathways we're going to take. If we were all in a room together, I'd have people do a show of hands, but absent that, I'll just have you think a little bit about some of these scenarios. For example, how many of you may have a child in high school that's making decisions about what is coming next? How many of you are at a point where you are changing your career? You've done so in the past, and you need really good information to help weigh the pros and cons. Do people know of someone who's been laid off recently and is needing to start over and reskill? How many people have debt still from college and at the time that they took out their loans didn't have information to necessarily weigh the implications of the loans they were taking out compared to the future salary that they might be making? So ultimately, all these questions and others that may seem familiar are really just about choices that we make in life. And right now, we're doing this in a context where education and workforce landscapes are more complex than ever, and people are navigating them with urgency as they have had their pathways disrupted by the pandemic, and other things are happening that are completely outside their control. And as we collectively figure out what we need to do next, we shouldn't have to make those decisions in the dark. We should have good information that enables us to make those decisions with confidence, because we really don't have time to waste on guesswork. However, getting that information is not necessarily as easy as a Google search. So to start us off, I wanted to share a couple of myths. First one is, people listening in on this may be in different roles. Maybe you're a person in a leadership position. And so reading this first one, right now, state leaders have the information they need to align the skills of employable adults with the needs of a state economy. That's not necessarily the case everywhere. Second statement here, no matter where I live, there's a tool that I can use to find all the programs that align to my interest area, what they cost, what employment outcomes I can expect when they graduate. Also not necessarily universally true. And digging into this example just a little bit, consider the example of a high school student, kind of mentioned earlier in some of those first scenarios, but a high school student that's thinking about what may come next. And we recently did some focus groups at Data Quality Campaign where we were asking people various questions about data they have access to and what they need. And one of the anecdotes that came up was about a student that was really interested in being a veterinarian. And this may come up often as people are navigating conversations where students say, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a lawyer, I want to be a veterinarian. But following further conversation, it turned out that what this student was really interested in was working with animals. And maybe that student will decide that they want to do 8 to 10 more years of, science curriculum to get there. Maybe they actually want to do something else. And wouldn't it be nice if there was a tool that enabled people to compare all of those different options that are available to them to understand, what they're going to cost, what skills that they need in order to pursue those, what skills they'll have when they leave. Tools like this can really cut through what I would consider as this false dichotomy in the conversation right now between college for all versus not everyone needs to go to college. And really the point being, people should just have good information to make the best decision for them. So how do we get there? This information is possible, having this kind of robust infrastructure, but it's still going to take some work to do it. And really doing so depends on setting a vision in a state for a really robust education and workforce system with goals that help individuals get the information they need and help leaders get information that helps them make decisions in support of these individuals. It is always critical for people to have access to this type of information, but particularly now as state economies are changing and people are having to navigate different pathways, people really need this type of information to understand what their options are, and states need it to understand where there are successes that they can build on or where there are places where people need further support. All of this is based on a strong foundation of P20W data systems, which are systems that connect data all the way from early education through the workforce with data over time. And these systems it must be a priority to connect data so that states have these systems so that they can really help people understand pathways and can understand patterns in the choices that people are making. Critical to this also is connecting this information about credentials so that people understand all these pathways and options available to them. So backing up quickly just a little bit to refresh people on what we're talking about when we talk about a P20W data system. For a long time, data really existed in silos. So you might have a bucket of early education data, you might have a bucket of post-secondary education data. States have made a lot of progress on connecting these systems in a lot of places, not necessarily everywhere, but in a lot of locations. And when we say a P20W data system, what we really mean is systems that include at least 4 components. And one is this early education data that has a number of things, including whether students are enrolled in these types of programs. It includes kindergarten through high school data, the K-12 piece, which includes things like attendance and graduation rates, post-secondary data, which includes things such as whether people are persisting through their coursework onto graduation, and workforce data that includes things about the job market and wages. Each of these components needs not just to exist, but needs to have the right and the most useful information that helps people answer the questions that they need to answer. And so what I mean by this is, for example, a state may have made great progress on connecting all these systems. However, if their workforce system doesn't have all of the indicators that it needs to answer questions, it may not do as much as it could. So for example, maybe in a state they know that 100 students graduated and went on to work at Exxon. And that's useful to know, to have that connection. However, it could be that 20 of those people are working on oil rigs and another person is the CFO. Both really important roles, but both that have very different pathways to those roles. And it's important to have those distinctions in that data so that people can understand those full trajectories and the pathways needed to pursue them. When all these things come together and when states have a robust P20W system, where you end up is not with silos of information, but end up with insights that help people along these pathways. Where the credential transparency piece comes in is that while P20W systems have a lot of robust information, the last critical component is this piece about credentials that provides the more detailed information that helps people understand all of the different options available to them and how they fit into this broader picture. What credential transparency demands is that this type of information is easily accessible, easy to understand, communicated clearly, connected to these broader systems, and comparable. Credentials is defined broadly. It includes everything from diplomas, apprenticeships, degrees, badges, everything else. Scott and Jim will get into this in more detail, but what it allows you to do is start answering questions such as, what credentials should I pursue if I want to become a nurse? Which programs are nearby so that I can get my degree while living at home and continuing to do my day job? What will it cost? What will I be able to do when I graduate? So it enables all of these different things, particularly when connected to the P20W data system, which then connects you to the outcomes of those programs. So I think there's, at this stage, pretty widespread recognition in states that this is important, but doing so will require prioritization, persistence, and investments in these systems. And states are moving the needle in a variety of ways to do this work. So all of these technical pieces that I've described don't happen without people. And some of the things that we've seen in states that are making this work, I'll talk through here. One of the most important things is just the political will to get it done. And one of the ways that states have done that is define sustainability for these data priorities. As we all know, there's often turnover in leadership at the state and local and other levels. This can lead to changing priorities. And states that have cultures that have really value innovating with and using data have found a way to protect those efforts. And the best way to do this is through cross-agency data governance structures. Because while not the flashiest of priorities, what they enable you to do is bring all the right people together to create shared priorities for what you're trying to accomplish and to sustain them across these changes. It becomes less about priorities of individual agencies and more about this whole system of supporting individuals as they're meeting their goals and making progress on state priorities. So one way is through governance. Another thing that states are doing is passing legislation to have a mandate for this activity. Kentucky and Maryland are states that have histories of passing laws and have had P20W systems in place for a while that are protected through legislation. Additionally, there's a number of states recently that have passed right to know legislation, which has put into law certain data that the state is required to make available so that people have real information about pathways and outcomes, which is signaling that it's no longer acceptable for individuals to have to make these decisions in the dark. And then state executives can make a lot of progress on data goals, whether it's building out P20W systems or connecting credentials to those systems by being really strategic about how they align resources. Executives can bring funds together from a number of sources, including emergency relief funds, so that people systems can be updated and designed so that people have a really good lens into how their efforts right now are helping the state recover education and the economy in the state system. And of course, this can't just be a top-down effort. There also has to be a culture demanding this type of information in states. And states that are the strongest have that culture as well. Some of this involves ensuring that the tools made available to people provide value. And so people need to know that if they go to that tool, they're going to get what they need. They're going to be able to understand it. Otherwise, they're not going to use it. It's helpful to have a robust network of advocates who can help keep the state accountable for their commitments and can provide cover when they're doing the right thing. And then finally, individuals need to demand it to, say that it's no longer acceptable to keep the status quo or have to piece together information from a lot of different sources in order to be able to answer questions and probably not completely. So really it's everyone's job ultimately to make this happen. So before I turn to my colleagues, just want to leave with a picture of what's possible when all of this comes together, when leaders and passionate individuals do the work in order to bring all this information into a place that provides insights to people. And so in this infographic here, you have a before and after image where the before is really showing where we are now and where there's a lot of uncertainty and frustration as people try and navigate the information that's available and frequently run into roadblocks. And where we want to get is to this future state where people have these insights. We no longer want people sort of stumbling through this current reality, but instead want people to be moving intentionally forward with more clarity and towards these opportunities. So as we all navigate these and the challenging days ahead, we can all do our part to invest in these systems and ask for this information to make sure we're moving forward intentionally. So I'm now going to turn it to Scott and Jim, who will tell you how to get it done.
Thanks, Jane. And really want to thank ExcelinEd for the opportunity to present to you all today. Working on this conference and preparing for this and just following the work of ExcelinEd over the past several years as they've been building out their information and their resources on identifying credentials of value has been really impressive to watch. And we've been pleased to be in the conversation with them and to be working with them on this. It's such an important issue. And just to pick up on where Jane left off there, she makes the point that we've got to get to a more clear environment about the important data that everybody needs about credentials. And why is that? It's not just that we're coming out of a pandemic where everything about education and training the economy has been upset and disrupted. There were a lot of issues on the table beforehand that have just been exacerbated, and it's forced us to understand that more and more people are looking for shorter term, easy to access, lower cost, highly relevant credentials as they're trying to find their way successfully through the marketplace to have family sustaining wages. It's also reflective of what's happening in the credentialing space itself. So a little insight to a forthcoming report. Oh, and before I go on, we really want to make sure that we're answering questions that you have as we go. So please, please, please be using the chat feature, the Q&A feature to throw questions out to us. We can adjust as we go and make sure we're answering your questions and not just waiting for the end. Really want to make sure we're being responsive to you. So this whole credentialing marketplace, in a forthcoming report that will be out early next year, so it should say 2021, not 2020, we've counted close to 1 million unique credentials in the United States alone. So going back to the slide that Jane had, everything from diplomas, badges, certificates, certifications, licenses, apprenticeships, and degrees of all types and all levels offered by K-12, community colleges, boot camps, Google, Microsoft, Salesforce, the American Welding Society, and the Indiana, nursing agency. All of these different providers of credentials adds up to just under 1 million. So when we talk about needing to understand which credentials have value, which credentials connect to each other, which credentials actually lead to good outcomes, having the ability to look across all of these and to have a common network, a common standard for discovering them, describing them, comparing them, analyzing them is even more important. And the analogy that I always use is, think about the days when you were trying to find a hotel room if you were going to travel across country. Think about the days we used to be able to travel across country. But the complexity and the time it took to find the hotel room, to find the airline, to find the ground transportation, to find everything you'd want. And now you can just pick up your phone and have it be immediately accessible on Expedia or Travelocity. All of that information being available as a new format to be able to get to this information is what we're working for here. So Credential Engine was developed and established to provide that common language, to be the Expedia of this new world of credentials and competencies and the connections to jobs and helping people find their pathways and their navigate their way through all of that. So I'm going to throw a little bit of a chart here for you, and you're going to notice that this chart has a different top line number on it. And hopefully, if you aren't using a full screen, there's a button at the top of your navigation, which is right between the lock and the 3 dots, which looks like a box. And if you haven't clicked on that yet, it's going to make viewing this chart a whole lot easier. This is actually from our report last year. We haven't released this year's report of the million. So this one counted 738,000 credentials. But I throw this up there because I want you to have an idea about where these credentials live. And as you're thinking about your role in education and training and what you're doing to provide a level of credential, whether it's at the K-12 level, whether it's at community college, whether it's in a vocational program, wherever you happen to be, this is the world that you live in, and you can get an idea here about what the level of the credential count is according to the where you sit in this ecosystem. So you can see how many high school diplomas we counted last year, how many 4-year degrees we counted, how many industry recognized certifications. And I'll give you an insight that the number that's coming out in our next report, the real growth here has been in the badges. It's been in the digital badge count, which is just down toward the bottom. And that number has grown dramatically. And that's because you're seeing more and more providers of credentials looking for ways to give short-term, quick, less than maybe 16 weeks, oftentimes less than 12 weeks, and to get really relevant, very just-in-time skills and competencies into people's hands that are highly connected to the actual skill requirements as stated by employers. So you're going to see a lot of static numbers across this in the next count, but a real growth in that digital badge count. So what is it that we do, and who is it that we try and be in this marketplace? We do not count anything to do with actual individual students or learners. We don't track anyone's actual accomplishments of what they've earned. We're here to make sure that we're giving consistent information about the credential itself. So again, back to Expedia, they're telling you what hotel room, what airline ticket is available, not who got it. What we're doing here is making sure that you have complete information about all the credentials in the marketplace, their competencies, their quality, the outcomes they have, the pathways that they're associated with, transfer value, all of that information. It's important to stress too that we are a public good nonprofit. We believe that this information is going to benefit people and the economy and educators and policymakers and employers so that they have all the information they need to be able to make the best decision about what they do. And we don't actually build the end product. We work with lots of different partners who are then building products and tools to share this information out with users. We're just that information and data level. So we've been doing this increasingly in partnerships with states. So those of you on the call may see the state that you're in located on this map. If not, you're going to see more states shaded in very soon. We're very close to having a formal relationship both with California and Connecticut. We're very close to having the additional 5 Midwest states that are working as part of the Midwest Collaborative or the Midwest Compact are going to be joining this work very soon. And then we're in conversations with a number of other states that we're not close enough to list here. But the real partners in doing this work with us have been states that have come along and said, we recognize the value of having this information across the entire state for our entire education and training system, for all of our employers, for all of our policies and our programs, whether they're state funding or federal funding that flows through states. But states have been the real impetus for making all of this work happen. So we'll be at the end of this year working with at least half of the states. And by the end of next year, we anticipate being in 40 to 45 of the states. And the work that we're doing is not just state driven and just US driven. We're actually beginning to have conversations with Canada and Australia and others as well, because this information is not dissimilar across country lines. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just to give you an idea of the technologies that we bring to bear, it's the common language that lets us have the ability to describe all this information. That's called that Credential Transparency Description Language. That is an open source resource that anyone can use. We have then tools that help people with publishing. We have a web-based credential registry. And then we work with a whole bunch of vendors to make sure that they're able to pull this data So for instance, in Indiana is including a requirement that their next statewide contract for career and education exploration services, their guidance counseling services software, has to be able to use data from the registry as linked open data as part of the services that they're delivering. Whole ranges of new learner records, whether they be transcripts or new digital learning records, are requiring the use of this kind of linked open data. So it's both in neutral navigation tools across all credentials, but also helping to inform the kind of digital transcripts that students carry with them that can then link to this data to give a richer picture about what that credential entails and how it connects to other credentials. So you can see pathways and you can see the kind of transfer information that exists out there. Just to give you a little bit of a deeper picture into the types of information that's included in these descriptions, everything about the credential itself, about the organization that issues the credential, cost information, any assessments that might be involved with all of this, the learning opportunities, so the programs and courses. And then the really fun stuff is the outcomes. What is it that you can associate as the earnings and employment outcomes? What are the connections to jobs and the employer requirements associated with those credentials, pathways, transfer value, and other more specific data that really helps you understand the value of and the quality of those credentials are things that can be captured and shared across the work here.
Scott, there's
yes.
a couple of questions in the chat box that I think now might be a good moment for you to take them, if that's okay, before you go on.
Yeah, no, let's do that.
One is that I can read them quickly too. One is that this person's coming from an organization that works to support military students who frequently move during their high school years.
Yeah.
They're interested in the transferability of credentials or courses towards credentials between states. Can you talk about that?
That is a great question. Sure. So the way to think about what we do is we don't define what that transfer value is, but we can make sure that the transfer value that is either associated with that work that student would have done in one school is describable in this data system, so that if the student is moving between Kansas and Japan and then to Germany and then back to Florida, they can actually, if there are transfer values that have been determined by either the issuer or the receiving entity, that information can be put into the system so that ahead of time, the receiving institution and the student and the parents can all know what the transfer value is and have that data be updatable, as well as ingested into the new student management system wherever that student is going, so that there's not a guessing game about all of this. And I'm glad you actually asked this about the military. The state of Kansas, and the reason I mentioned Kansas, the state of Kansas is actually going to be publishing all of their transfer value recommendations for all military education and training, so that everyone who's leaving the military, and I know this reflects adults and not the students, but the same principle applies. All of the transfer value for every military training that Kansas recognizes is going to be published into this system. So it's all available as full open data. And we should be doing the same thing for students coming out of those schools in military education.
Thanks.
Is there another question?
Yep. So the next one is there a metric or indicator in the engine that would allow users to discern which credentials are highly recognized by education or employers? Framed in the Expedia example, it would be like a user rating letting you differentiate between hotels you're attempting to pick between. Is there something like that?
Yes. So we do not have at our level the kind of user review functionality that says, the users say that this credential is more of value and we like the professor better and the classes were easy to get to and those kind of things. What you can have is the ability for an employer, say, to indicate this is the credential that we recognize and that we're looking for. You can have a state, and I think Jim will talk about this, you can have a state say, these are the credentials that we recognize and that we determine to be of value and therefore eligible for this funding source or this funding source that we've determined are the ones associated with in-demand industries or occupations. So there can be third-party indications of value. We're just not the ones to do it, and we don't allow the subjective user reviews to be done in our platform. But another tool that pulls the data in and creates something like an Expedia, they could include that if they wanted to.
And then one more, are you able to link the credential back to the individual across the agency data using something like master person identification with anonymity?
So we do not touch the individual level data at all, but systems that do track individuals and that know what credentials that individuals are earning can link into the system and be able to get the rich information about the credential that is deeper than just the name. Like, Jane earned the diploma at this high school and also earned a certificate as part of her career and technical education program. If the school system or some other entity knows that Jane had X and Y, we are where you go to see the details about X and Y and how they connect to each other and what those connections are then to the community college or the 4-year program or the license or the job. But we don't do that in our systems. FERPA scares me. So I'm gonna wrap up here because I'm a little bit over my portion of our allotted time, and I just want to leave you with back to the state conversation and back to what Jane was talking about earlier, and the good transition on to Jim, is that we are increasingly not just working with states to publish information and to make this data available for users, but we're thinking more and more about the policy aspect to this, and how do we get more states to adopt policies to ensure that credential information is fully public and fully transparent. And so we've been working with Jane and DQC and these other partners to put together a series of policy briefs. The first of which is going to be making the distinct case that the great work that DQC and ECS and others have been doing around P20W data systems needs to be extended, and the natural extension is to include credential transparency as that indicator of labor market value that all of this education and training is contributing to. And so the first policy brief is going to be about how do we make sure that people understand that P20W includes credential transparency, and then there'll be others on quality and equity and the state role and other things. So we'll make sure that you all are on the list for those if you give us your emails. And also just wanted to point out here that this link, I put a link in the chat to this particular roadmap and action guide. So if anyone wanted to go download it, you could pull that up and use that in your state to think about the next best steps. And the best way to understand what states can do is to turn it over to our next presenter, Jim Purcell, who is the CHIO down in the great state of Alabama.
Well, thank you. The big thing is we're really appreciative of actually having something that's out there, this national database in which we can sort of use as a template for the things we do in Alabama. As you can see, Alabama's a robust state. We have all kinds of things, but the big thing right now is our economy is growing so fast. It's been very successful, but we've looked and identified that we're about 500,000 short in credential holders. And it's not necessarily the bachelor's, associates, or even the traditional certificates. But a lot of time, these short-term certificates that particular industries want or need to address their needs of the workforce. What we've decided to do in our state is to actually create this thing called the Alabama Credential Registry, where organizations in the state of any kind can actually submit the credentials that they offer to their employers or to businesses or to just individuals. So we sort of know really what amount of credentials are really out there and what we need to do to address the needs of the industry. And that's very similar to what the national model is to promote that transparency and really to be a clearinghouse for all the credentials of value. And we'll talk about that in a minute a little bit more. There's this group called the Alabama Committee on Credentials and Career Pathways. And basically what they try to do is to look at the things that are submitted to us and determine which ones are of value to Alabama's economy. And we actually get down to the regions of the state because Alabama's got a lot of microcosms out there that have different emphasis in their type of needs. And then the big thing is to identify who those providers are and to give some credibility to a lot of providers that produce things. And I'll give you an example for myself. I was an insurance agent for a while before I went back and got all my degrees. And I had an undergraduate degree from Auburn, but I went to a community college to get a short-term certificate in insurance. Once I got into the insurance company for Allstate, there was all kind of training that they had, which provided industry credentials. So there's a lot of providers out there. They say really 3/4 of all the education out there is done not in the traditional format, and we just needed to quantify what that was. And so this is really how we work at it. We have the credential provider, which could be your normal institutions, business and industry, the high schools, corporate training. Associations do things, or the unions, and they submit what they do, and they use the same template that Credential Finder has formatted, and they send it to us, and we send it to Credential Finder for that to be on the national registry, and then we actually sent it to this ACCCP, which will determine the credentials of value to Alabama. And what we do is we rate it on the number of jobs are out there. The average salary has to be 70% above the median in the region. And there has to be so many positions open annually as projected by some national database. So that's sort of the format we do to make sure that people can quantify the value, sort of rate it like Scott was talking about at Expedia. We can do that in Alabama by this committee determining which is important to our economy. So this is what we've done since July when we started it up. We've got 23 providers already. There's 8 more universities to do some things, but this is some examples of the other businesses that are out there. Everything from these organizations like BASF, that's a company that's training their particular people, down to Duxon Limited, who is training people how to be good conservators of nature that we have in our state. And then even these associations that have to train people to learn how to judge livestock or something, they could put their certification and indicate where you can get that training, what the cost is. And then of course, a lot of business and industry we anticipate will be in there, like Southwest Airlines, in training their people. And since July, we've got 196 credentials submitted for review. And we plan, or our expectation in the pipeline is there'll be a lot more very quickly. ALSDE is our K through 12 governance structure. We believe that they'll be sending them all in one fell swoop, and we'll have those. We have the additional universities are working on theirs, and universities aren't used to having somebody wants you to quantify every vignette and everything. So it's a learning curve for those guys, but they're doing well. The community college, on the other hand, their system is they have a central system, and they'll be providing it all in one fell swoop, and it'll be really nice. There'll be some evidence of what is transferable or not. And then we have a big office of apprenticeship through the governor's office, and we have some training credentials that are a part of that component. And then we're looking forward to other industry associations and businesses kicking in and providing what they do for training in their area. And so here's some examples. The Meat Science Association, they make sure we know how to evaluate our meat, and then somebody knows how you do it for cooking and those kind of things. You got BASF is just taking care of how you do plant science certification within their component. And then you'll sort of see the traditional schools. Here's University of Alabama, Huntsville. We do a lot of rockets and things up there. There's a lot of government contracting. And so they actually have certificates basically at the undergraduate level, but people from the community can actually come in and get some of this training. And then at the graduate certificate level, people can come in and take specific short-term vignettes and things perhaps that are related to their job. And so this is sort of what you would see on the Credential National Database about a particular thing. This is the NCR Core Credential, and I'll sort of show you what we use this for in Alabama. So in Alabama, we like to build things that blow things up. We have gun manufacturers, missiles, all kind of things. So here is the missile assembly in Troy, Alabama. I was looking for somebody that knows how to do a Rockwell Automation Programmable Logic Controller PLC thing, and there is actually training for that. And so that sort of quantifies what that is. So if somebody really wants to get a job with in Troy at that particular place, they're going to need to have some credentials, and this sort of quantifies that for them. And then this is just another example. As you know, Microsoft has all these industry certifications, and we sort of identify here as a particular job in Birmingham that wants to have this kind of training. So an individual or student can sort of see, as I move along, do I need to have specific vignettes? And I'll say we're actually working real hard with the universities to get them into the workforce preparation game. Not only do they want them to have, the creative thinking and all those things that we value, but we do know that employers look for some type of industry credential or evidence that they know how to do industry work to get in the door. So certainly the first job is really dependent on somebody being able to illustrate their ability to be valuable for a particular position that's open. And this is one way we can do that, by embedding these things in the universities as well as at the community colleges. And if you have questions, you'll see my stuff down at the bottom.
Great. Well, one of the things I love about Jim's presentation there is how well it highlights just the breadth of credentials available and why it's so important that they're transparent. Like, I certainly know, until seeing his slides, I had no idea you could get something related to horse training. And so having more transparency into that is definitely critical. Thanks to those of you that already put questions in the box earlier. We'd now love to open it up to further questions about anything, and we're keeping an eye on the room chat. So please go ahead and type in there if you have any further questions for us.
I'm not there. I'm off mute now. I'm going to jump in and just, ask Jim while we're waiting for some questions. Assuming that we've got people on the line here who are kind of more frontline education and training, and if they're looking to be able to, say, contribute their credentials in Alabama, but you're working in a CTE program or you're working in a local community college, what's the best way for any individual to be able to act on that and getting their credentials if you were in Alabama or likely any other state?
Right, and what we've done is we developed a page. On the bottom there, you'll sort of see credentials.ake.edu, and then you would go there and it would ask you, are you a provider or you're an interested person? And if you're a provider, you hit that button and you sort of register, and then you sort of tell all the details about what your program is. The nice thing about it to me is for a lot of these people who do really good training that's really not on the radar for those of us traditionalists, is that they can actually prove through this comparative context that they are something that is worthwhile for employers to make happen.
And we do have a new question that came in. Is there any effort to align Credential Engine with the Common Education data standards?
And the answer is yes. We work very closely and have been since our inception, and actually before we became an official entity, to map our standards to CEDS, to IMS Global, to PESC, which is a higher education standard for sharing transcript information primarily, to HR Open Standards, which is the standards for how Human resources information is shared at the corporate level. I'm going to now blank on the other standards, but we were at the forefront of making sure that our standard was being mapped actively to all these other standards so that they are truly interoperable. And we continue that work, even today.
And I will say that, if you get a certificate or a credential through something like this, there is a crosswalk to college credit. American Council of Education has done a lot of work there, and they'll actually say if somebody has, the Microsoft certifications, it qualifies as three hours of credit at this level in computer science. And then the same thing for like the insurance training that I did. The fact that I have those pieces of paper, it'll give me like 9 hours of college credit in insurance. So there are some crosswalks that allow you to provide some credit and transferability to other vignettes, other educational opportunities later in your life.
And just to pick up on that, Jim, we are actually working with the American Council on Education to publish their entire credit recommendation library. So all of the thousands of credentials that are issued, or even just short-term trainings that may not end up in an official credential, whether it's from McDonald's or an insurance training company or fire safety, all of those in the private sector, as well as all of the military work they've done over the years to give credit recommendations, all of that information is going to be published into the credential registry as linked open data. That should be happening early next year.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Jane, I'm going to take the opportunity to throw a question over to you. What were, as our resident expert here on P20W data systems, what would be your recommendation for people on the line who are thinking about how to make sure that their state's P20W does actually, begin to think about inclusion, credential transparency, and that kind of information in the work? What can anyone do just kind of locally to be a voice for that work?
That's a good question. And, we at Data Quality Campaign, we always go back to these, that place where I kind of ended with what are, the people policies, practices that can be used to do that. Certainly, locally, just starting to, in whatever kind of maybe local governance or whatever channels up to the state, just starting to ask for it and, ask for it to be included. I mean, the more pressure that people get or hear that this is value, the more likely it's going to be prioritized at the state level. So I think that, a lot of progress can be made, quite honestly, just through those efforts. So, I would start there.
And I'll say right now, because of the, even before the pandemic, you had the automation renovation or revolution. That really has required us to have people really develop skills that are slightly different than what they made their money out of prior. So we have to have some kind of way to do that, and to do it faster than just putting everybody in a 4-year degree program or whatever. Because some of these short-term certificates are especially valuable to our employers who, they build machines, they build cars and trucks and aircraft carriers and things of that nature. So, but they sort of know what all those vignettes are, and we just need to make sure that we have the ability to train people to take those jobs.
Right.
And a great way to illustrate some of this too is, and again, whether local level, individual, state, is just, starting with your questions too, like what can't you answer right now, or what do you want to be able to answer that can illustrate why you need, this type of information in order to navigate these options. So there are a number of things that, maybe you can piece it together by clicking on 20 different things on the internet, but, maybe you can't answer it easily at the moment.
And I will say too, just doing it regionally helps. The more granular you can get your information. Workforce is a lot like politics; it's all local. and you really need to address the needs of your community in educating locally. Most of the people that stay in your community for a long period of time are from there. So you really need to take care of the home folks. One of the things that people tell us is that, the AB students are going to find opportunities. They're going to find the American dream wherever they go, but it's really your C or D students coming out of high school or even through college. Those are the guys that are going to hang around, and what you do with those guys to help them become successful is really what's going to build your economy. And to me, the best way to do that is to focus on very achievable vignettes that are educational and really address the needs of business and industry in your area.
And I want to emphasize, and that is a great point, Jim, and one that we've talked a lot about when we're working with regions. So it doesn't have to be state or bust, right? I mean, working with the state gets you the level of scale, but we work a lot in Los Angeles and hopefully soon in Dallas, in other, sub-state regions where people do stay home. They get their education and training. They start a family. They have jobs within 50 miles of where they went to school. And so having this action from a local school district or a local community college or a local BOCES in New York, you don't have to rely on the state to do this. You can act on this locally and make sure that your school district and your partners in a catchment area are all making sure that their data is fully transparent so that you're helping the residents of that region, even if the state isn't quite ready to move or just hasn't been able to act on this quite yet. So act locally, think nationally.
And I will say the other thing is just to make sure that those credentials are transferable. You can have a certificate that's, done by BASF that's in plant certification, but as a reviewer from the state side, we try to look at it to make sure that it is a certificate that actually has some transferability from BASF to something else so that it has worth for the individual, either in the workplace or in higher education later.
Great. Any final audience questions? All right, well, we will close out. We will hang around for the next few minutes just for in case people think of anything else. But thank you, everyone, so much for attending today. And, I hope that you take away something that you can take back with you to make progress on your credential transparency goals. So thanks again for joining us.